Chapter 26. Pull in a little. No, he thinks you want him to stop. You just want him to slow. Better. Now have him speed up. Slap those reins. Whoa, not too fast. Watch this turn. Cattle have the right of way, so pull in hard and let this herd pass. Anne held the reins in her leather-gloved hands and watched as a boy followed a small herd of cows across the mud street. She squinted her eyes almost shut, but still the sunlight sent stabbing pains through them. It had been over 2 months since she'd been outdoors. "I think you're ready for Pennsylvania Avenue," said Mr. Bigelow, who sat next to her in the driver's seat. He directed her onto the cobblestones of the wide avenue. The loud clatter of the carriage wheels over the stones was suddenly familiar to Anne. "The powder boy took me along here," she said loudly over the noise. Pennsylvania Avenue was filled with scores of other carriages, wagons, and horses, one flock of sheep, and clouds of dust billowing around them all. Anne had to dodge a large omnibus overflowing with passengers, pulled by an entire team of horses. "I think we'd better go back to the side streets," she shouted to be heard. "Not until I show you where Franklin Pierce lives," said Mr. Bigelow. "The president?" Anne asked in amazement. "That's where you'll be leaving from, directly in front of the White House. Sometimes the best place to hide is the last place anyone would expect to find you." Mr. Bigelow took the reins himself to guide the carriage. He nudged her and pointed as they approached a magnificent building. It was white with tall, slender pillars set far back on a grassy lawn. A bronze statue of a man stood proudly looking out at them. All around the lawn was a black iron fence, its sharp posts pointed skyward like 1,000 spears. "The statue is of Thomas Jefferson," said Mr. Bigelow. "So we have one president on the outside of the White House and another president on the inside." Anne stared in awe. She blinked and squinted harder, hoping to catch a glimpse of Franklin Pierce on his veranda. Mr. Bigelow took her past other important buildings. They passed the hulking Treasury Building, which had more tall columns than Anne could count, and the Capitol, with its mountains of white marble steps, pillars, and huge wooden dome. On their way back to Mr. Bigelow's house, they passed the General Post Office, with its towering gray marble walls and black iron fence. "Decisions for the whole country are made in this city," said Mr. Bigelow. The sheer size of the buildings had made Anne feel the importance of the decisions made inside them. As they rode the last couple of blocks, Mr. Bigelow went over their plan one more time. A professor from one of the medical schools in Philadelphia would come to fetch her as soon as his Thanksgiving vacation started. His Underground Railroad name was Dr. H. They would meet in front of the White House, and with Anne acting as his driver, they would cross the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania. He would accompany her first to Philadelphia, and then to New York City, where she would be delivered to members of the New York Vigilance Committee. Anne's life was beginning to change very quickly again, and she didn't feel the least bit ready for all of it. Back in the humble row house, Anne blew into her hands to warm them. With the curtains drawn, her eyes felt much better. "Let's have tea," said Mr. Bigelow. They both went to the kitchen. Anne filled the kettle with water she'd fetched earlier, and Mr. Bigelow rummaged in the cupboard for biscuits. Suddenly there was a loud pounding on the front door. Anne jumped like a startled cat. She dropped the kettle and ran to where her ladder should have been. It was gone. In a panic, she rushed back to the kitchen and clutched Mr. Bigelow's arms. "Where shall I go?" she whispered hoarsely. Mr. Bigelow loosened himself from her grasp. Out of a closet, he brought a groom's box and handed it to her. "You are Joe Wright, my coach boy," he said calmly. "Where you will go is outside to curry and brush my horse, as soon as you have served our guest." Anne tried to calm her breathing. Mr. Bigelow opened the door. To to an angry Sergeant Orme. "You could have hidden 5 fugitives in the time it took you to come to the door." Sergeant Orme shoved his way into the house. He was wide and burly, with straight red hair that stuck out from under his policeman's cap. "Pardon me, I was in the back of the house, in the kitchen, making tea," said Mr. Bigelow. "It's been reported that the Weems family is here night and day." Sergeant Orme narrowed his eyes. "That missing Weems girl can't be far away." "I am friendly with the Weems family. They've been visiting me on Sundays," said Mr. Bigelow. "Would you like some tea? Or a glass of water, perhaps?" "Water," Sergeant Orme grunted. "Joe, get the officer a glass of water, and get it fresh, mind you," Mr. Bigelow said to Anne, who had been standing like a statue, holding the groom's box in both hands. Anne set down the box and went through the kitchen and out the back door to the water pump. Though the air was cold, she felt sweat drip down her back. She pumped a fresh bucket of water and carried it into the house. Her hands shook terribly as she filled a glass with the icy water and handed it to the officer. He didn't even look at her. "Get back to your work now," said Mr. Bigelow. Anne was thankful to leave the house. She patted the horse on the nose, and he snorted at her. He nuzzled her hand, looking for a treat. "If you stand still for good grooming, I'll bring you a carrot," she told him. The rhythm of the curry comb against the horse's warm back calmed her. She brushed him all over and picked out his hoofs. When she was done, she said, "That miserable Sergeant Orme isn't gone yet, but you deserve your carrot." She took a deep breath and marched up to the house. Inside, she was shocked by what she heard and saw. Sergeant Orme had Mr. Bigelow by the collar. "I think you know where that Weems girl is, and when I prove it, I'll have you thrown in prison for so long your own mother won't recognize you when you get out." He thrust his rubbery face to within an inch of Mr. Bigelow's nose, then shoved him away. He cast an indifferent glance at Anne and left. Anne was horrified. "Did he hurt you?" she cried. Mr. Bigelow adjusted his collar and straightened his tie. "No harm done," he said briskly. "But what if he figures it out?" she whispered. What if Mr. Bigelow was sent to prison, or worse, because of her? "My dear, that man is such an imbecile he can't figure out which shoe to put on first in the morning." Anne twisted her hands and said nothing. "Don't be so worried," said Mr. Bigelow. "Whom was he searching for?" He gave her an amused look. "And where was she?" Anne tried to see the humor in the situation, but she was still quite shaken. Mr. Bigelow held her shoulders firmly and looked at her hard. "You will face guards and sheriffs and constables from time to time on your journey." He went to his desk and pulled out pen and ink. "Let's do this immediately. It will help you remember who you are." He took an official-looking piece of paper out of an envelope. It had printing on it and a raised seal. He mumbled as he wrote on the paper, "Name, Joseph Wright. Place of birth, York, Pennsylvania. Description." He glanced up at her several times as he wrote, "Light-skinned, slender, freckles." He signed the document with a flourish and folded it back into its envelope. "Your freedman's papers. Don't let them off your person." Anne slipped the forged document inside her jacket. Freedman's papers, just like her father's, only they were for her other self, her Underground Railroad self. "And let's hope all the constables from here to Canada are as stupid as that Sergeant Orme," Mr. Bigelow said. He pulled back the curtains and peeked out front. "How is my horse doing? Still confused from breaking in a new driver?" "Oh," Anne suddenly remembered the carrot. "I promised him a treat." She went to the larder, found a carrot, and held it up with a smile as she passed Mr. Bigelow on her way out the front door. She broke the carrot into pieces and shared it with the horse, then rested her cheek against his jaw and listened to the hollow crunching as he chewed. The sky grew red with the sunset, and the words, "From here to Canada," echoed in her mind. Thanksgiving was in just 8 days. Dr. H would be coming for her soon.